Let's talk about the rest of the 6 books I read in the month of December. If you want to see my previous video about the first 6 books I read in December, I will link that above. And yes, I am a little bit behind in doing some of these wrap-up videos, but I've just been quite busy this year. So yes, we will be discussing 4 fiction books and 2 nonfiction books. I have some of them here that I got for Christmas. Yeah. And as always, the books will be listed in timestamps down below. So let's get started. The first book I will be discussing was You Are the Snake by Juliet Escoria. This is a collection of short stories and was published by Soft Skull Press, which is an indie publisher. I really liked this, actually. I was surprised that I enjoyed it as much as I did. I heard about this book from a Sunny Book Nook, and they were not really a huge fan. It does deal with... It's very much slice of life, pure, gritty realism, and it really follows girls and young women who are in some way deeply troubled. Oftentimes they're working class, and we sort of go from Southern California to a little bit like New York City to West Virginia, which I think sort of follows the author's own trajectory as she's lived across the United States. And so the collection is divided up in, kind of starts with stories that are centered on girlhood, and then later on we see as the main characters get older. Juliet Escoria has said in at least one interview I read with her that she's a big fan of Lucia Berlin, who I actually had to DNF her short stories last month. And I can see that influence, but I actually much prefer Escoria's writing style. I feel that the stories, even though they're very slice of life, they had a little bit more of a narrative structure, a little bit more of character development. Some of the stories do end rather abruptly in this collection, which I think is just in general an issue I have with the vast majority of short story collections. But in some ways, I was just more invested in this. And I think it has to do with, there were aspects of this I could relate to. Much of these stories deal with female adolescent rage, and it was written about in a way that I honestly haven't encountered in fiction, because I think when we talk about female rage and the way girls and women are socialized is that rage and anger that you feel tends to be projected inward into a sort of self-destruction rather than outwardly projected. And the women and girls in this story project their anger outward. There is a lot of violence that these women face, but then violence that they enact outward towards other people, or even just fantasize about it. And I had never really encountered that in fiction before. To me, it brought back a lot of the feelings that I had as a young girl. A lot of this anger I had at just being a woman in the world, I think, and coming to terms with that as you go through adolescence, and also rage that is due to being an outsider. And I think she really captures that essence quite well. I mean, for me personally, I listen to a lot of anger music, so that helped me. A lot of these stories also take place in the 90s and early to mid 2000s and even the early 2010s. And I think for me too, there was also an element of nostalgia as someone who grew up during this time period. I think the author she's about 6 years older than me, so we're not like too far apart in terms of our age or even like our generation. So the standout stories to me in this collection, one was The Other Time a Grown Man Threatened My Life, where the protagonist works at this strip mall, and there's this mall cop that starts hanging around her friends who are other coworkers at the mall, and he's this weird, creepy skinhead guy, and he starts giving the friend group beer and liquor, and they all seem to be fine with him, and she just does not trust him, and then eventually he knows that, and then shit eventually bubbles over. It honestly reminded me a little bit of a scene in Aria Aber's Good Girl. There's a story called Dust Particles, which is deeply sad and disturbing, and it's ultimately about how sexually abused children can mimic and act out the sexual abuse that they themselves are receiving. It was subtle and deeply unsettling. And then another standout I liked was Hazel, a diptych. I'm not sure if I'm saying that word right, is about exploring intergenerational trauma and mental illness and trying to imagine and understand relatives who are sort of castigated aside as the black sheep of the family, and trying to reimagine their life and why. And the story is done in this style of overlaid narratives with like a slight magical realism element. So yeah, overall, I did enjoy this, and I think that is kind of a bit odd to say because the subject matter is quite dark, and there is a starkness and simplicity in her writing style juxtaposed to the content. So yes, there are, I would say, major trigger warnings on this collection, but I don't know, it resonated with me in a way that I wasn't quite expecting. I rated it 4 stars only because, like I said, I do feel there was an abruptness to some of these stories where things were just starting to pick up and then the story just ends. And so I felt like we could have explored some of those themes a bit deeper. But yeah, I recommend this. I enjoyed it. So yeah, I rated it 4 stars. The next book I read was The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. This was published in 1920. It is, of course, an American classic. It won the Pulitzer. I think Edith Wharton was the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize. And I rated this 3 stars. I know that sounds a little bit blasphemous for a classic, but let me explain. So this is a story about rich people in New York City in the 1870s. So it is a historical fiction novel. And even though it was published in 1920, it very much reads like a 19th century novel. It reads like it was written, I think, in the 1890s. And I believe that is because Edith Wharton was an older woman when she wrote this. She was in her late 50s, and so she still has that cadence and writing style of what we associate with the 1920s. And it was a bit jarring for me because it's hard to sort of imagine that this was published 5 years before The Great Gatsby, which also deals with rich people in New York and the loves and affairs and messiness of them. And yeah, I'm going to be honest with you, I am not a fan of 19th century writing. I have learned that about myself. I have reaffirmed it. And so I just find it to be so arduous and meandering and overly detailed to the point that I'm like, get to the point. What are we talking about here? This is a lot, the novel has a lot to do with like societal expectations and doing what you feel or what you know is expected of you, and versus, acting on impulse and marrying and following your heart. And so we follow, there's like the main character, his name is Newland Archer. He is a wealthy man. I don't really recall. The beginning of this starts with like talking about all these different families in 1870s New York City, and how each of them essentially, we get a little bit of like how each family like amassed their fortune and who is related to who and what their relationships are, and so is this person's cousin twice removed, etc., etc. And so we follow Newland Archer, this young man who is engaged to May Wieland, and she is considered to be respectable and just perfect for him. And so at the beginning of this story, her cousin, Countess Olenska, comes to New York City from Eastern Europe. She was married to a Polish count, I believe, and she is separated from him and she is seeking a divorce, which is quite scandalous for that time period. And Newland falls madly in love with her. And then the feeling is mutual, but they cannot obviously act on this. And it's even more complicated by the fact that Countess Olenska is May's cousin. And Newland sort of assumes that May has no idea about this secret love between them. So like I said, this novel deals a lot with the classic love story of being torn between what is morally right in the eyes of society versus following your heart. Family honor, respectability, marriage as a business transaction, which is the origin of marriage, versus marrying for love and companionship, which is an idea within history that came much more recently. And particularly for rich people, it has always been about preserving wealth and family inheritance and building your own continuing on that inherited legacy, heirs, etc., etc. This was fine. Like I said, it is just not really my style of writing. It does drag in parts. As I mentioned in the beginning, there are so many different families, and I had trouble keeping track of everyone, and I wasn't even sure if it was really necessary to understanding the story. I think if you like Jane Austen, perhaps you would like this. For me, I just could not really care less about rich people at the opera and what so-and-so wore as being scandalous. It's just not really my jam. You know, I can acknowledge that the writing is good, but it does blow my mind that this was written 5 years before The Great Gatsby, because it just feels so different. And yes, I do much prefer The Great Gatsby to this. I liked the ending. I wasn't expecting it. I do wonder, actually, if Sabahattin had read this at any point, because I did see some similarities between this and Madonna in a fur coat. But yeah, overall, this is just, like I said, it's not my style of writing. So don't be deceived that it was published in 1920, because it is very much, truly feels like a 19th century novel. 3 stars. The next book I read was Happiness and Love by Zoe Dubno. I got this for Christmas. This is a 2025 release. It was newly released. And this is a very short novel. It is a brutal satire. It is one woman's rant against the modern New York art world that is condensed into one single evening. That is basically it. This book is essentially one long paragraph. And when I started to read it, I was like, oh no, I don't know if I like this. But then I did actually get into it. It was kind of like a train wreck that you couldn't look away from. So the unnamed narrator, she lived in New York, and she was sort of under the wing of these 2 rich art collector people who she essentially views as parasites. And she was sort of like under them as like their... I don't really know how to say it, like under their care, or just like ensconced within their world. And then she just got so fed up, she went and moved to Europe, and now she's come back because a former friend of hers, Rebecca, has tragically died. And so all of these people within this world attended Rebecca's funeral, but afterwards they go to this dinner party at these 2 rich people whom she hates, Eugene and Nicole, their names are, and they are gathered at this dinner party post Rebecca's funeral to wait for this very important guest, who is this sort of semi-famous actress. And the whole time, the narrator, she's unnamed, is there. She's just sort of going through this like brutal takedown of how all of these rich people are hypocrites, they're all insufferable, they're all pretentious, capitalism ruins art, blah, 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 blah. Rich people hoard and collect art without understanding it, yada, yada, yada. I rated it 3.5 stars. This actually, and I didn't realize it until the very end, there is an author's note where the author mentions that this was loosely based on Thomas Bernhard's Woodcutters, which is set in 1980s Vienna. And it has the exact same style, where this man who is ensconced within the art world is attending a dinner party post like a late friend's funeral, and they are waiting for some sort of famous actor to come to the dinner party, and he's just going through in his head how much he hates everyone there. And when I looked up Thomas Bernhard's Woodcutters and also looked at what other people were saying, people said this is not loosely based. This is identical to the original work, including the final culminating scene, because this does end in sort of like something, I should say, some sort of like moment of conflict. And I was like, I don't really understand what the point of writing this was if it is so much a carbon copy of the original work. I mean, yes, you changed the scene and the time, but why is this so closely based on a previous work? What does it really add to the original work, and what is the point? And so I haven't read Thomas Bernhard's Woodcutters. I mean, maybe I will. It just did make me kind of reevaluate the work. Nonetheless, I rated it 3.5 stars. I can't say I recommend it, but it was definitely it was a train wreck. I kind of couldn't look away. I kept reading. You can see there was a lot of like observations I thought were witty and it resonated with me, but also there were things I think that I've heard before, right? And I think in general that the narrator is perhaps not quite aware how much she has in common with the people at this party. It's like, girl, you protest too much because, why are you with these people if you hate them so much? So, yeah, 3.5 stars. The next book I read was another 2025 release, and that was Pick a Color by Souvankham Thammavongsa. I'm so sorry, I'm probably not saying that name right. This is a very short novel that takes place over the entire day at a nail salon. And the main character is a woman named Ning. She is of unnamed East Asian ethnicity. And she runs this nail salon called Susan's, where every worker at the salon goes by the name Susan. And all of the women, also of undisclosed East Asian ancestry, all have to wear black. They all have to wear their hair the same way. And Ning runs kind of a tight ship. And so you have sort of the politics of this nail salon where people are sort of close. The women are sort of close, but they're sort of not. And things are rather fraught. Like at one point it's like, oh yeah, we're all in this together. And then the next it's like, get out of my face. It's not personal, it's business, right? And so over the course of the entire day, Ning narrates about the different customers that come in. And we hear a little bit about these customers' backstories as well as the co-workers' backstories. And while we're going about the salon, Ning also kind of ruminates on her previous career as a female boxer. And there's sort of like metaphors to her working on people and even just going through life and kind of making that extended metaphor to being a boxer. I think that I thought that the boxing aspect would add a little bit more to the story, and it was an interesting juxtaposition, but it was just sort of there, and I don't know if it really added or made the story as unique as I thought, or if it was really worked in as deftly as I wanted. The funny thing about this is sort of the author takes the idea that, yes, all of the women who work at the nail salon are indeed talking about you in their language. And I think a lot of this book does sort of deal, it's playing with the idea of people who are in the service industry and are essentially faceless and just sort of expected to serve other people, and they're not really given any sort of autonomy or voice. And I think that is, the author, is sort of like playing that in your face in the way of how these women are all very homogenous on purpose by the way that they are dressed and the way that they are styled and the names that they go by. For me, this was another 3.5 star book. I thought it was fine. The prose is very sparse and very minimalistic. I did sort of expect maybe that this novel, at the end, there was some foreshadowing throughout the book, and I thought it would culminate in something bigger, and it really doesn't. So if you like slice of life stuff, particularly about working class people, you might like this. But yeah, it was just fine. It was pleasant enough. 3.5 star read for me. The next book I read was a nonfiction piece, and that was A Failure of Vision, Michael Harrington and the Limits of Democratic Socialism by Doug Greene. This was published by Zero Books, which is an indie press. Now, I talked about this in my best books of 2025. I had recently read that book, and I did actually end up really enjoying it more than I even had expected. This is a biography of Michael Harrington, who is not really that well known anymore, but he was the founder of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, which is the largest socialist organization in the United States and probably within, I want to say, the past 10 years has started to gain more and more traction. So although Michael Harrington is no longer really well known, I think even within people who are members of DSA or have, like myself, considered joining the DSA, his ideas still really live on. And so earlier this year, as I've talked about previously, I had read Reform or Revolution by Rosa Luxemburg. Now, that was a collection of her writing that was published in the 1890s, and so the cadence of the language and a lot of the current political stuff she was writing about went over my head. But her argument was that a lot of reformists who call themselves socialists have ruined, or rather taken away, the revolutionary aspect of socialism. What has happened is it's sort of become just trying to alleviate the worst aspects of capitalism rather than creating another system. And I know that I am sort of paraphrasing a summary of Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism is no alternative. But this book, kind of, by having a biography of Michael Harrington, it sort of traces, it's like an updated version of, I think, a lot of what Rosa Luxemburg had been arguing against, only it is grounded in the United States and from the mid-20th century to the present. And so these sort of ideas of reform specifically within the Democratic Party, is still something that is repeatedly seen to this day in a lot of political candidates, in a lot of sort of like center-left-ish social media figureheads. And Doug Greene traces why Michael Harrington's ideas don't work, and essentially why they have repeatedly failed time and time again. Because I don't think that people are aware that this whole idea of taking over the Democratic Party, making it more amendable to the working class, to socialism, has been tried so many times. And the reason for this, and I am sort of paraphrasing, but I already knew before I read this, is because you cannot transform a capitalist imperialist party. It is not going to happen. And so when I see certain people say, well, we just need to take over the Democrats the way the Tea Party and MAGA took over the Republicans, that doesn't work, because right-wing populism is not a threat to capital in the way that left-wing populism is. And so I was able to see so many parallels, and I think sort of Michael Harrington's ideas, how he sort of tried to like both sides things or straddle the line, how he was both siding aspects of the Vietnam War, and then when he didn't want to like criticize it too much when a Democrat, LBJ, was in office, but when Nixon was elected, then it was okay to publicly speak out, even though student activists and protesters had been speaking out against it for so long, because people knew inherently that it was wrong. Doug Greene doesn't get into this, but Harrington was also quite, it's briefly touched upon, very hostile to Black liberation movements. He was an ardent Zionist, which is discussed in this book. And he was very, very much like a sort of anti-communist sort of warrior. Like the idea that like communism was more of a threat than liberals' appeasement to fascists, if you could say that. And so I think that even though Greene really like eviscerates Harrington's ideas, there still is like a modicum of respect that is given to him, at least in terms of his outreach, even if it was so misguided. And the book sort of comes to the conclusion that it's had long-lasting damage. I could see a lot of parallels, even in like previous presidential campaigns of Jesse Jackson. We get a little bit into like Jesse Jackson and his run in 1984, and then again his second run in 1988, and kind of how Jackson had to really tone down his language, was tone policed, had to shift his ideas to be more palatable. And even when he first started running in 1984, even though he was running on like a sort of like democratic socialist, social democrat platform, Michael Harrington was still quite hostile to him. And yeah, it's just interesting. There's so many parallels of these thoughts and ideas that keep being regurgitated over and over and over again within American politics. For anyone who is left of center or just left wing, we see these arguments time and time again. And so I think that is really relevant to read this book. There is an appendix in this section where Doug Greene does an analysis of Harrington's analysis of Marx and why he believes that Harrington was incorrect. And so some of that language, specifically on spiritual materialism, went over my head. He has pointed out, the author, that Harrington's baby, the DSA, has broken from Harrington on certain kinds of issues. But it still sort of remains to be seen, even if the DSA does, I think, do really good work at the local level. The problem is still the electoral aspect of funneling candidates into the Democratic Party. And those candidates are not really held to be accountable. They either have to change, as we can see in language of certain candidates, or they get voted out, or they get silenced. And so I think that's the problem, is that a lot of times the DSA has sort of act as a way of like funneling revolutionary movements into the Democrats, where those movements are effectively co-opted and neutered. So yes, I did write this 4.5 stars because I think that his points were really well articulated. I would recommend you read it if you are anyone who is center-left, left of center, left-wing, and you're wondering, where do we go from here? And then the last book I read was Greater Than the Sum of Our Parts, Feminism, Nationalism, and Palestine by Nada Elia. This was published by Pluto Press, so again, another indie publisher. This is an academic book. It is quite short, although also somewhat dense, that talks about how Palestine is a feminist issue, and sort of traces the bonds of solidarity, acknowledges like how all of these interweaving, overlapping systems of oppression are all interlinked. It discusses a lot of like the double violence that specifically Palestinian women face, as well as also talking about the gender-based violence that Indigenous women of Native Americans in the U.S. face under the system of a settler colonial state. So there's a couple different chapters in this book. I think it's a really good like basic introduction. I think if you want to know a little bit more about Palestine, and it kind of like, she dissects a lot of different sort of like Zionist propaganda tactics, such as pinkwashing, like this idea that Israel is just like only safe haven for LGBT people, and that Palestinians are homophobic and transphobic, and that only like Palestinian LGBT people are safe in Israel, which is just not true, because as someone says in this book, it was an activist, there is no pink door on the apartheid wall for queer Palestinians. A lot of this too is sort of like a tracing of how Zionist propaganda has evolved over the years. The early Zionists were very clear about Zionism being a settler colonial movement, and then during like a lot of like the decolonization that happened within the global South, as well as the civil rights movements in the United States of African Americans, the American Indian movement, etc., that obviously fell out of fashion. That was obviously poor taste. And so propaganda has evolved in different ways beyond just like the pink washing. There's something she calls like red washing, or this claim that like Israelis are more indigenous than Palestinians, which is of course absurd, as Palestinians are indigenous Levantines, the same as Lebanese people. Just because you speak Arabic doesn't mean you're from Arabia. And she sort of like breaks down this sort of like line by line, or like you could say section by section chapter. I mean, I overall kind of knew a lot of this as someone who has read about Palestine since like 2018. I've read a lot about it. It's just a topic that really interests me and something that is close to my heart. And so I don't know if I necessarily learned anything new. I I think that sort of when she was making parallels and talking about like the violence, that disproportionate violence that Indigenous women in the U.S. face, there was certain facts and statistics that I was not aware of. There was also a couple things I learned about like Palestinian LGBT organizations, both within Palestine and the diaspora. I had learned about. And there is actually a book that I want to read. I'll have to buy it because it's an academic book. It's called Queer Palestine and the Empire of Critique. So yeah, that is on my TBR. And of course, like I said, I do want to read more Native American writing. So yeah, I do recommend this book if you are still sort of like learning or new to the topic. I think it's a good like starter. The language is a little bit academic. It's not like super, super dense like Mark Fisher, but it isn't always like the most accessible because she is an academic. She's a grassroots organizer, the author, and she is a core member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective. So anyone who's a feminist, anyone who cares about Palestine, I would recommend this book. And I rated it 4 stars. Yes, that's it. Those are the 6 books I read in the second half of December. Let me know if there are any that I talked about that you have read or want to read or that are similar. And yeah, I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.